Hello and welcome to Top Story. The whiff of scandal that clings to Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert threatens once more to undermine his leadership. An opinion poll published in Israel's biggest newspaper this week shows that 59% of Israelis now believe Olmert should either resign or leave office temporarily while a police inquiry completes its investigations into his financial affairs. At the heart of the matter, one question. Did Olmert accept hundreds of thousands of dollars of bribes from a wealthy New York businessman during electoral campaigns stretching from the 1990s to 2002? Olmert, who categorically denies any guilt, has survived several other corruption scandals in the past. But his political capital is running short. 60% of those polled said they believed he had pocketed bribes and questioned his authority to lead the peace process. There's growing concern in Washington, and President George W. Bush arrives in Israel on Wednesday, that Olmert's domestic troubles could undermine the Palestinian-Israeli peace talks. Well, joining me now to discuss the implications of the Olmert corruption probe is Jean-Pierre Filiou, who's an associate professor at the Institute of Political Studies here in Paris and the author of a recent book on Islam. Thanks very much for being on the programme. How much of a blow do you think, or how much damage could this recent scandal involving Olmert do to the peace process?
Well, it's a series of blows that have been dealt to the peace process because of the weakness of the ruling coalition now in Israel. You know that Ariel Sharon really exploded the Israeli political landscape by creating this new party, Kadima, with former Likud personalities like Olmert and labor leaders like Shimon Peres, therefore creating a center party that could deliver withdrawal from occupied territories. The whole bet on this formula is damaged if the Kadima leadership is threatened. But we've seen before, as you said, that Olmert survived many crises. The level of unpopularity which today was the same he had in the summer of 2006, and he's still there. So he could overcome this crisis, even though now the mood is pretty gloomy in Israel.
The fear, too, is that if he does step down, of course, there will have to be elections. And the Palestinian negotiation, the peace talks, Saeb Erekat said this about that. If they decide to go for early elections, we're jobless for another year. We'll see more settlements and more Israeli army incursions rather than talks. That's the kind of election campaign they have. There's more than a grain of truth in that, isn't there?
The anticipation is quite correct. Yeah. The problem is that now Kadima, the center party, is a real driving force behind the actual restrained, timid peace process with the Palestinians. But Labour Party is pretty hawkish. It's not at all a peacenik alternative. So, in fact, early election could damage the whole dynamics of peace. So the question before was, is there a Palestinian partner to peace? And now it could be replaced by even a more troubling one. Will there be an Israeli partner to peace?
Is there any reason to think that this scandal should be any different from the ones that have gone on in the past? Is there any more reason to think that he might be forced to go this time?
It's difficult to know. It depends on the amount of data that already you have some puzzling testimonies that were made public. But if you really take into consideration the state of Israel and its security, the conclusion of the recent Vinogradov report that were drafted after the summer 2006 war in Lebanon were far more damaging for the credit of Olmert as a statesman, and he stayed in power. So we never know. He could be kept in place.
How damaging is the cumulative effect of these sort of things? With several corruption scandals, and as you mentioned, the Vinogradov report on the war in southern Lebanon as well. What does that do to the confidence of Israelis in their political system?
If I may add to that, sex scandals that involved even the former head of state of Israel. You know, the level of trust of the Israeli public in its political class is already very low. And it's probably one of the most negative lessons that can be drawn at the 60th anniversary of the Jewish state, is that era of Ben Gurion is really over. Probably Yitzhak Rabin was the last leader with, at the same time, the charisma and the moral prestige to lead his nation into the peace process. Sharon, we will never know, because he disappeared when he was beginning to enter a new era with a new dimension of his political life. Probably none of what we are seeing now would have happened if Sharon was still ruling the game in Israel.
If he does decide to step down and new elections are called, who would be the front runners most likely to replace him?
Well, actually, the bets are very high on Tzipi Livni,
the foreign minister at the moment.
Minister of Foreign Affairs, that has a lot of charisma and who could be the leader, but there are a lot of contenders, so that would open a new chapter of internal rivalries inside Kadima that would further weaken this party.
This must all be enormously frustrating for the Bush administration. With George W. Bush arriving in Israel on Wednesday, hoping to jog the peace process forward. It's simply just not going to happen while this sort of thing is going on, is it?
This is very frustrating, but what is happening in Gaza and in Beirut is even more frustrating, because the Arab opponents to the peace process are getting more and more strength every day. And this is so on both sides. He's seeing his two guests of Annapolis, President Mahmoud Abbas on the Palestinian side and Ehud Olmert on the Israeli side, being weakened. So that must be extremely frustrating for him.
Well, it must be well nigh impossible with this sort of scandal spinning around his head for Olmert to be able to concentrate on the key issues.
Certainly, one could imagine that in a normal working day, a significant amount of time and energy is devoted to that crisis and not to the peace process or to the war in Lebanon or to other pending issues.
And that, I'm afraid, is where we have to end it. That's all we have time for today. Thanks to our guest, Jean-Pierre Filiu. Join us again tomorrow for another edition of Top Story. Goodbye.
Top Story, the